My name is Ben Montgomery. I work with Dataiku. I am the lead governance consultant, or AI governance consultant for the EMEA and APAC regions. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about how do we build governance to make sure that we can maximize the AI business impact. So how can we get the most out of our AI using governance? So a very brief and very unofficial history of governance and how we got here. If we zoom right back about 40 years, organizations started investing a lot in buying computers, right? Mainframes, terminals, that kind of thing. With lots of computers, then of course you need somebody to manage those computers, and so is born the IT department. They're still there today, they're still crucial, they play a very important role in enforcing the standards and in defining the standards that flow throughout the organization. Fast forward a little bit of time, we start getting a lot of developers. We start moving into more complex problems. With lots of developers, there comes a need for another governance framework. That governance framework is a series of rules which developers subscribe to as best practice. That's DevOps. And the majority of teams will follow some kind of DevOps protocol. Fast forward again a little bit, and we get to kind of where we are now, which is having a lot of models, right? So a lot of computers, a lot of developers, and now they're making a lot of models. That's great. I remember about 2 years ago, MLOps was just the hottest topic. Everybody I spoke to wanted to talk to me about MLOps. They wanted to know my thoughts on it. They wanted to know how they could do it, how other people were doing it. And that's kind of died down a little bit because it's sort of gone into the mainstream a little bit now. But MLOps is a very, very fundamental framework for managing the collection of standards which goes around how we manage the models that we've developed, how we productionize them, what do the data pipelines look like, how can we ensure that they're consistent. So again, another governance framework coming off the back of a critical business need. Now over on the right-hand side, there are three things which are sort of kind of there, but not quite. The first one is AI regulation. It's definitely coming. The most pertinent one for perhaps most of us is the EU AI. It's a whole lot of vowels. Draft regulation, still in draft, but that's going to impact everyone. Other geographies, we're kind of keeping an eye on these. Other geographies are following suit as well, taking slightly different approaches. But the regulation is coming. The second thing that we're missing at the moment is widespread governance tooling in the market. So Dataiku is making a play there. Some of our peers are making a play there, of course. And there are new companies that are coming in as well. But there's no sort of well-established, it's still a very nascent market for governance tooling. And then the third thing is the actual impetus to actually need to solve these problems. And that's when we start talking about AI being deployed at scale. So if we take a step back and have a think about what AI governance means, we've got a definition of it in Dataiku. This is what we go by. And our definition is that an AI governance framework enforces organizational priorities through standardized rules, processes, and requirements that shape how AI is designed, developed, and deployed. Quite a lot in there. Let's break it down a little bit. The first thing is enforcing organizational priorities. I always find this one really interesting because whether or not you feel ready to have a discussion around what is your AI governance framework, every organization has priorities. They have objectives, they have goals. They might be implicit, explicit, but the objective of the framework is to draw those out and codify those. The second part is standardizing rules. If we're, again, thinking on the same theme of bringing in AI at scale, then necessarily we're going to be touching teams who are less familiar with AI, who are less familiar with the concepts. It's really important, therefore, to try and reduce friction with those teams. It's going beyond now the preserve of data science, of course. So anything that we can do to standardize our meanings, our terminology, our definitions, this is going to help reduce friction across all those teams. And then if you put those two together, the objective really is to be able to produce auditable models that are explainable, that are robust, and where we're essentially minimizing risk. So quite a lot in that definition. Now, a bold statement here. So I was speaking with a client of mine over the past few weeks, and they shared this with me. And it made me think quite a lot. So they told me that our objective is to embed AI into 70% of all of our business processes within the next 5 years. So immediately that jumps at me as very ambitious. There's a large element of scalability there. 70% of all business processes across the organization is a pretty lofty goal. And then there's a time frame on it as well, 5 years. So really what they're saying is we are sold on the value of AI and we now want to double down on this. We want AI to be having the maximum impact across the organization, and this is the metric that we're going to use to track the impact that AI is having across the organization. So definitely a bold objective, and I think worth breaking that down a little bit. So I asked myself a couple of questions about this. The first one, of course, is this even a sensible objective? Is this something that we should be helping with, that we should be striving towards? This maturity curve is very familiar to me. We've been working with the same maturity curve since I joined Dataiku 5 odd years ago. And you may look at this curve and think that you're in a certain point on that, and that's fine. You can be anywhere you want on this curve. But as a general, what I've seen over the past 5 years is the core cluster of companies has moved from 5 years ago around the exploration and experimentation phase to now having established the value of AI. It's not in question anymore. We know that AI can drive value if it's executed properly, if it's managed properly. And then the next steps are expanding that and then finally embedding that. And that's what this client is asking for. They really want to embed AI. They've proven the value. They're happy with it. They really want to say, okay, let's embed that into all of the processes that we possibly can. So just to take you through that very quickly. Over on the left-hand side, we've got exploring. So, one or two individuals determine that there's a need to look into AI with a little bit more depth. Then experimentation happens. We choose 1 or 2 projects. We try and test the value on those. We establish the value. Then we look to expand the value throughout the organization. And then the last step is embedding. I would add another step on this, which is, of course, governance, because it's in my job title, so I have to say that. But genuinely, I think it's going to be very difficult and very challenging for organizations to effectively embed AI at scale if they're not thinking about governance. And I'll go into that in more detail as we go through. So, still, is it a sensible objective? There's a really great quote from a Scottish MP called George Galloway. And he said that nothing can happen for decades, and then decades can happen in weeks. And despite the fact that my transitions are not as fluid as I would like them to be, and you can already see where I'm going with this, I am, of course, talking about the pandemic. So I put one graph in there. It's one example of many, but I found it really interesting. This is looking very specifically at US e-commerce penetration as a percentage of total retail sales. And if you look at the 10 years up to 2019, it was gaining about 1% a year. And then if you look from 2019 to April 2020, the curve changes. It's no longer linear. And in a period of 8 weeks, thanks to the pandemic, or due to the pandemic, it gained more ground, more percentage points than it had in the previous 10 years. And there are a lot of examples of this, and I think for me, COVID is going to be remembered as amongst many things, but it will definitely be remembered as the great accelerant. It's taken a lot of trends that were already there, and it's accelerated them. Think about working from home, think about how you consume media, think about, there's a million examples. But this one I found really interesting, and at the very, very beginning of the COVID pandemic, I think we all remember where we were at the time. I was sitting in the office, and I remember getting the email saying, we're shutting down our offices, everybody go home. We all took all the food out of the fridge, of course, had a little bit of a party before we left, as you do. But there was a little bit of a sense of worry, because I wasn't quite sure how things were going to go. And it could have gone one of two ways. Either companies would see turbulence in the market, uncertain future, and they would look at their spending on AI as potentially an area for cost reduction, right? It's an easy amount of money that you can cut if you're in trouble and if you want to kind of shore up the ship to navigate the turbulence. But in fact, that's not at all what we saw. the trend that we've seen has been similar to the e-commerce penetration one. Rather than reducing AI investment, the majority of our customers actually took another look at AI and they said, okay, we want to keep it, but we expect more value from it. We want this to be one of the ways that we navigate through these turbulent markets. They increased the speed that they're adopting AI. They increased the investment that they're making in AI. And it really became an integral part of the organizations getting through the turbulence. So it was really nice to see. Really nice to see. But in general, I think we really have been through a period of great acceleration over the past 2 years. And as a result, that curve, that adoption curve that we were just looking at, it's no longer linear. And that's why it doesn't surprise me as much when a client now comes to me and says, we want this in 80% of our models or 70% of our models. That's just that exponential growth, which fits with the market. So is it a sensible objective, right? Our first question, I believe it is. I believe it fits with the market. I believe it makes sense. If you, as an organization, have established the value of AI, it makes sense. Why not increase the surface area and make sure that you can get the most value that you can? So I agree with it. Second question, what actually do we need to achieve this? Is it even possible? So first of all, we're going to need buy-in from senior leadership, stakeholders. There's going to be a lot of individuals who are going to be impacted by this. They need to be on board. We need an understanding of the total population of business processes, because we can't accurately quantify that 70% if we don't know what the total population is. That's an exercise in itself. We need an agreed methodology to define and track success. We need the right tooling, we need the right people, we need the right skill sets, etc. Definitely not an exhaustive list, and a little bit more operational and beyond the scope of where I'm going with this presentation today, but worth bearing in mind. All in all though, there's clearly work involved, but I think, yeah, it's very much possible. And the third and final question, what are the risks? Can we effectively mitigate them? Can we foresee them? Can we mitigate them to actually make this successful? And there's a lot of risks. I picked out a few, but let's take them one by one. The first risk that I see, and the most obvious one, is the speed and the scale of the initiative here. The initiative is to embed AI into a percentage. We're not discriminating on whether or not people are familiar with AI. We're not discriminating on what business units. We're not filtering on anything. It's an absolute quantifiable amount of business processes across a very large organization. So doing that within a short time frame is going to pose some challenges. So what will we do there? I think it's really important to have some effective and trusted quality control so that it's verifiable. People know that the right QC steps have been followed. The model that they get into their process, they know it's been checked, quality controlled. And they know that the decision process has some kind of standardization to it as well. We need reliable value testing to make sure that any models that are going into existing processes are actually enhancing them as opposed to causing harm, right? We need to track that. And then once models are in production, it doesn't stop there. We have to keep monitoring them. So the second thing is a lack of trust. This one's very interesting because I asked them, is this 70% of just the business units that are impacted by AI at the moment? And they said, no, this is 70% of all business units. So there we're bringing in individuals or teams who perhaps have had no exposure to AI, have very little knowledge of AI. It's not their role. And it's very important, therefore, to have good clarity of the decision process. We need documentation. It has to be explainable. Centralization risk, similar to the last one. The stakeholders need to be decentralized in their own teams. They need to be involved in the process. We don't want to have a situation where people feel it's above their heads and they don't understand it, and decisions are being made centrally and having negative impacts on distributed business units. Miscommunication, terminology is very important. So we have in Dataiku something called the govern node. I would never recommend that somebody installs the govern node without a proper governance framework defined as well. It's really important to remove a lot of the subjectivity that you can have when you use any tooling, reach some agreed objective definitions, and have everybody speaking the same language. And then the last one is compliance. I'm not going to go too heavy on the compliance thing here, even though I do love it. But it's important to be mindful as we're developing these. The EU regs, for example, haven't been released yet. They're in draft. But if you're going to embark on a project like this, it's worth looking at them. It's worth making sure that you're compliant ahead of time so that you don't undo all the good work that you've done previously. So, answer to the question, can we mitigate these risks? Yes. With an effective governance framework, we can anticipate them, we can mitigate them. If we come back to our definition, that's exactly what we're looking at here. So we've found our organizational principles. We're trying to reduce friction by standardizing some rules. And we're essentially creating a framework that will define the requirements that will shape how this exponential scaling of models is going to be achieved. An analogy, if you will allow me to take that piece of text and break it out a little bit. So this is an airport, and we're talking about AI governance here. So AI governance is, I would say, the airport regulations. There are a couple of pieces that fit inside it, but if we look at the regulations for a second, AI governance determines how the airport functions, when it opens, who's allowed to be inside it, who has permissions to do what, and it manages the interplay between all the different stakeholders within that. The next one is the control tower. Control tower is the equivalent of MLOps. I would say it's a part of AI governance. MLOps and the control tower are managing the runways. They're managing which planes are allowed to land. We don't want two planes landing at the same time, or a plane landing when one is taking off. We need good pipelines. We need reliable pipelines. That's your control tower. And then the last one, which I think is really important, is responsible AI. These are your pilots in the planes, and they would be the equivalent of your users, your end users of a model. So let's say that you're a telco, and your model is determining whether or not I'm allowed to get the new iPhone, for example. I don't care how you set up your airport. I don't care how you're deploying your models. What I care about as a passenger in that plane, I care about the pilot in the plane. If there's turbulence, I want to know that my pilot is reliable. If I'm interacting with a model that you've put out and it's making a decision for me, I want confidence as a consumer that you have made the right determinations to make sure that that model is not biasing me in some way, that it's not making edge case decisions. So the pilot there is our responsible AI. And I think all these three fit together really well under the umbrella of AI governance. The way that we look at it when I'm speaking with clients is kind of a three-step thing. So I always start with defining the governance framework. I think that's fundamental to using any tooling. We need to understand the objectives of the organization. We need to understand what that means and how to translate that into a objective and easily understood framework. Once we have that, then we can start looking at the pipelines, the plumbing. How are we deploying our models? What data am I allowed to use? What am I not allowed to use? And then finally, the oversight. And this is where the new Dataiku node comes in, but substitute that with whatever tooling you like. The essence here is that governance doesn't stop when a project is defined and a model is developed. Governance needs to continuously monitor that. The regulations that are coming are going to be asking you to continuously monitor that. So you need an effective way of doing that. We need approvals, we need sign-off, we need to know the individuals that were making the decision at the time, what information did they have available to them at that time that they made that decision. We need audit logs, both internally and potentially externally. These are really important data points to be centralizing, and they don't always easily come out of a development environment or a code environment. So there is a need for something else to give you this oversight. So really just breaking that down, the approach that we take is, first of all, we define, right? So the AI governance framework aligns the organization's intentions with the outputs. Consider the risks. They're very real risks. They have the potential, especially if we're looking at things at this scale, to have some potentially negative risks. So we want to mitigate those. Then we prepare we make sure that the values and objectives are translated into measurable criteria. So when we embark on something like this, we can track the progress of it. And then finally, execution is just ensuring, this is my favorite point, that the necessary guardrails are in place to allow AI to scale safely. I think governance gets a bit of a bad rep. Unfairly, fairly, maybe. I think if it's implemented in a very obtuse way, it can slow people down. If it's implemented correctly, the objective that we're aiming for is not to slow people down, but to speed them up. What do I mean by that? If I'm developing and I know the guardrails within which I can develop, I know what I can use, I know if I want to use a certain data set, I know how to get the approval for it, I know the risk appetite of the company, I know the risk appetite of the business unit. If I know all these things off the bat, that's going to stop me from wasting time or making the wrong decisions. So those are my guardrails, and that enables me to develop within that channel. And especially when we're talking about deploying AI at great scale, I think it's very difficult to do without those guardrails. So in summary, we're certainly in a period of accelerated adoption and embedding of AI into business processes. Thumbs up for that. I'm a big fan. Embedding AI at scale does introduce risk, sometimes considerable risk, depending on how it's implemented. And therefore, in order to maximize the benefit and the business impact that you can get, if we're looking to scale AI, if we're looking to increase the impact of AI at scale, I think it's really essential to have an effective AI governance framework, and of course the right tooling to execute it, whatever your choice might be. Thank you very much.